Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the Cove, the home of the Australian Profession of Arms, broadcasting to you live from Victoria Barracks in Sydney. Today's Cove Talk is brought to you in association with the Australian Army Research Centre, who every year sponsor an eminent academic in war or strategic studies as the Keogh Visiting Chair. Named after the founder of the Australian Army Journal, the Keogh Chair comes to Australia to promote debate on land warfare in the contemporary operating environment. Well, this year the Keogh Chair is Professor Ian Morris from Stanford University in the United States. A prolific author, Professor Morris has written many books, including War, What Is It Good For?, as well as Why the West Rules for Now. Well, without further ado, and on behalf of the Australian Army, the Australian Army Research Centre, and the team here at the Cove, I would like to welcome Professor Ian Morris to Cove Talk.
Thank you for that, a very kind introduction, and it's great to be here at Victoria Barracks. Beautiful spot. So I've been invited to come along here and talk a little bit today, and I'm going to talk about the rise and fall of modern battle. And for civilians like me, when we think about war, what we tend to think about is battles. Even though obviously professionals in arms, you know, battles fill up a pretty tiny part of the career of any actual soldier. And my Uncle Fred, I mean, our family doesn't have a distinguished military tradition at all, but my Uncle Fred fought with the 8th Army during the Second World War, and he fought through almost the whole of the North African campaign, never once saw a German, let alone fired a gun at anybody. And he said, so far as he could make out, war consisted of jumping into the back of a truck, driving through hundreds of miles of sand, getting out of the truck, sitting in the blazing sun for a day or so, then getting back in the truck and running back to where you started before the Germans found you. He said his closest brush with danger in the whole of the war was losing his false teeth in a sandstorm. So I learned from Uncle Fred pretty early on. Battle is not the typical thing that soldiers spend their time doing. But since I became a historian and an archaeologist, what I do for a living, what I've also learned is that the kind of battle that armies nowadays fight, that is nothing like typical of what has happened throughout the longer term history of war. And this is what I want to talk about. By background, I'm an archaeologist and started off as an ancient historian. I like to look at the really big picture across thousands of years, across the whole world, see if we can get a sense of what the big trends have been through history and where they might take us in the future. So what I want to do is basically talk about as I see it, there's been three kind of periods, three kinds of battle throughout history that have dominated warfare. What I'm going to call tribal battle, traditional battle, and modern battle. So talk a little bit about each of the three of these, and then say a little bit about where it seems to me things might conceivably go in the future, and what battles in the 21st century might conceivably be like. So, okay, so this is my plan. And when I say I like to do a long-term history, I mean really long-term. And typically, I tend to find you only really get a sense of what's going on if you go back about 15,000 years to the end of the last ice age. Then you see these very, very long-term trends. And so, I'll do this. I'm going to talk about these three different sorts of battle that I think we've seen throughout history. And the first of these, the oldest of these, is what I call the tribal battle. And so far as we can make out, this sort of fighting, this goes back all the way to the origins of modern human beings, which seems to be about 300,000 years ago. And these kind of tribal battles, this is what you find right up till about 5,000 years ago. So almost the whole of human history here on Earth. And these tribal battles, the way we know anything about them, we've got basically two kinds of evidence. One is what archaeologists dig up, which is stones and rocks, basically. That from the bones, human skeletons, we can learn quite a lot about the way people died, about kind of lethal trauma on people in the past. And from the kinds of stone weapons they made, we can deduce a certain amount from that. So we've got the archaeological stuff, but then we've also got anthropologists over the last 200 years going out and visiting and staying with small-scale modern societies that basically still live in the Stone Age and have Stone Age technologies. Then we try to put these two together and kind of make analogies from the modern Stone Age societies, put them together with the archaeology and see what we can figure out. And a lot of the anthropological information we've got about modern Stone Age fighting, a lot of that actually comes from Australia. Back in the 19th century, when Europeans first were settling out in Australia, they were encountering societies that never dealt with Europeans before. We're still living in very, very traditional ways. They're able to learn huge amount from these groups about how you do stuff in a Stone Age environment. And then more recently than that, even into the 20th century, in Papua New Guinea, a lot of observation of Stone Age societies kind of battling it out. And the sort of picture we generally get of what these tribal battles were like, the societies involved were really, really small. So throughout almost the whole of human history, most people live in groups of a dozen, 20 people. They have to be really small groups because you're living by hunting wild animals, gathering wild plants, and you're moving around constantly around the environment as different animals migrate, different plants ripen. You have to move to catch up with it. So really, really tiny little groups of people. The groups, they have very little internal hierarchy or structure. They're like big family groups, basically. People more or less do what they want. There's some constraints on them, but they're very, very small scale, very, very simple institutions. And there's the sort of picture we've got of these societies now is that they fight a lot. It's not that they're more violent than people are today innately, psychologically. It's just that there are less constraints. And so something where, if you get in an argument with one of your friends and you're kind of tempted to punch the guy in the mouth, a lot of consequences are going to follow from that. These are not necessarily consequences you're going to like. And so we've sort of learned not to use violence to settle our problems quite so much. In the smaller scale Stone Age societies, there's not as many constraints on you. Things tend to escalate to violence more often than they do in modern industrialized societies. So starting in the 19th century, these anthropologists, they like to go out and look at these societies and see what happens and see how they settle their disputes, when they use violence, when they don't. And one of the things that they discover is that there's a lot of fighting going on in these societies, but not much of it is in the form of battles between societies, and almost nothing of it is in the form of battles anything like we'd recognise. And so Australia, New Guinea, the Amazon basin, places like this, what they find is that, say, if you've got two groups of hunter-gatherer peoples, small 20, 30 people, maybe 40 people, they have a conflict going on between them of some kind. And often what they do, they'll say, we need to have a battle. That's what we need to do to settle this. We're going to have a battle, and let's have the battle on Friday. And show up on Friday by the bent oak tree or whatever it is, someplace we all know. We're all going to show up at 9 o'clock in the morning on Friday. We're going to have our battle. And so the young guys from each of these groups will go out to the bent oak tree 9 o'clock in the morning on Friday, and they'll line up to form kind of two loose lines, and they'll contact all their relatives in other groups, and so a few more guys will show up as well. They'll form these two loose lines, and they form them just out of missile range, whether it's bow and arrow or throwing javelins or just throwing rocks or whatever the local missile weapons are. They form up just out of missile range of each other, and they kind of yell abuse at each other. And then every so often, one of the young guys, to show how what a tough guy is, he runs out in front within missile range, so everybody else is now throwing stuff at him. And he yells a lot of abuse now. And he'll throw his own missiles, and if he's really tough, scary guy, he'll actually run right up, almost up to the people, almost as close as I am to the front row here. Not quite close enough to get hit, but really close, and then run back again. But sometimes what happens is the other group runs out at the same time. They actually do run into each other. There will be serious, little bit of scuffling goes on, and somebody gets hurt. Very often, at that point, they stop the battle. They call it up and say, whoa, wait a minute, Bill got hurt. We stop fighting. Or sometimes it goes on for a while and nobody gets hurt, but they're getting really hungry now. It's lunchtime, so they stop fighting because it's time for lunch. Or sometimes it rains and they stop for rain. So yeah, it really is like cricket. And this is what the anthropologists observe. And they say, okay, this is interesting. This is different from the way we do things. The battles are heavily ritualized affairs. And they figure out really quickly what's going on here. This is not like, Rommel seeking the decisive battle in North Africa or something. This is a display of manhood. This is a way to increase your prestige within your group by being brave in this battle and maybe even getting hurt. And so the anthropologists, they come home back to their universities and they say, well, okay, these simpler societies, they're not violent the way we are. They are much more peaceful than us. Now, what they didn't see was they tended not to stay very long in these settings they were in. They tended to only stay for a few weeks, a few months among the people they're studying, then go back home. What they didn't see was that these primitive battles, as they call them, are just a part of a larger organization of violence within these societies. Because actually a lot of people are getting killed violently in most Stone Age type societies, so far as we can tell. Rates of violent death might have been as high as 10%, 15%. So you think 1 in 10, 1 in 5 maybe even. That is a lot of people to be dying violently. But it's not happening in battles. What tends to happen, these battles are these ritualized things, but then people are getting killed in like murders between the groups, and little ambushes. And so like, we're having a feud with a neighboring group. They've stolen one of our women or something, one of the very common causes of these feuding. They say, okay, we're going to get them. We hate them. We're going to get them. We're going to lie in wait when the guys are coming back from a hunting party, and 6 of us will jump out on 2 of them and smash their heads in with our stone axes. Or if things are getting really nasty, we're going to creep through the forest or whatever the environment is, up to their little encampment, their village. And then during the night we do this. And then we lie in wait around the village during the night. And in the morning, people in the little village, they wake up. And one of the first things they will do is people need to fulfill the call of nature. And they will come out from the little area of shelters they've got and do their stuff in the trees, and we'll kill them. While they're doing their stuff, we'll kill them. And then we'll run away. And the studies of this, more recent studies of this, as anthropologists started staying a lot longer with the groups they're looking at, they found that what was tending to happen was people would use lethal force when they really outnumbered the targets that they were attacking. If it's an evenly pitched battle, there was very little sense of honor. Sort of a traditional sense of the honourable fair fight between groups, very little sense of that. Almost no sense of patriotism. Like, I will take risks for my village. No sense of I'm fighting for my gods, nothing like that. And when they talked to the people they're studying about, well, do you not feel this sense of honour fighting for your village? People would look and say, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. Don't you feel the need to defend your god against the rival gods of the other group? And people say, no. That's stupid. And what they found was that like the big difference between these warriors in the Stone Age societies and the kind of soldiers we've got in more recent societies is there's nothing like any kind of discipline or hierarchy. And so we've got this quarrel going on, but there's nobody to give you an order telling you to go there and fight and stand your ground and be brave. You take a risk if you feel like doing it. You run away when you feel like doing it. Nobody will really hold it against you when you run away. If there's a chance you might actually seriously get hurt. The fighting gives you a chance to show how brave you are. It's just totally lacking the kind of structures and hierarchies that we are familiar with. So the fighting, it all works in a very, very different sort of way. And the battles are really a sideshow compared to the main thing of ambushing people, murdering people out in the forests. Now, this all starts to change. So far as we can tell, this goes on for tens of thousands of years, this kind of fighting, this role of battle within armed conflict. All starts to change, though, about 5,000-6,000 years ago, initially in the Middle East. And what has happened is that after the end of the last ice age, world warms up, agriculture becomes possible, of domesticating plants and animals, farming them like we do in modern times. It becomes possible to do this. Populations really, really start to grow, and the old way of living as hunter-gatherers moving around constantly, that becomes harder and harder again, starting in the Middle East and spreading out progressively across the rest of the world. And as these societies grow and get bigger and more complex, they start to accumulate much more wealth. They're building pyramids and ziggurats and all these sorts of things. Inequality increases within the society to the point that you start to get proper governments and states with kings ruling over them. Almost always, kings are people perceived to be blessed by the gods. So the extreme case, we have ancient Egypt, where the king in ancient Egypt actually is a living god walking among us. And other places, they don't go quite that far, but kings are always people blessed by the gods. And even in the modern world, a little bit of this survives. Like the British royal family, Queen Elizabeth II is queen by grace of God. I mean, that's the official title, like, by grace of God. She has been anointed with holy oil. She is closer to God than the rest of us are. I recently met Princess Anne for the first time in my life. She did not seem particularly close to God as far as I could make out. Very good at doing her job, but I didn't seem particularly close to God. But there's this, remnants of this idea of royalty of society. The farmers created these highly unequal societies, and as they did so, wealth starts to accumulate. And now, by the time you're getting, say, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago in the Middle East, the villages, the towns that people live in, there's all kinds of wealth concentrated in these places that you didn't have in hunter-gatherer society, which have almost no material wealth in them to speak of. So there's a lot of good reasons now, if you've got a quarrel going on with the neighbouring group, a lot of really good reasons now to go over to their town, storm the place, steal all the stuff, steal the people, sell the people into slavery, which is something, again, you don't really get in hunter-gatherer societies. So this sort of thing starts happening more systematically, people going plundering other people's villages. Now, the societies are getting bigger and more complex and more organised, so they're able to defend themselves a lot better. And certainly by about 5,000 years ago, lots of them are well enough organised that they can build walls around their cities to keep the raiders out. So now you want to go and loot the city of Uruk, say, in what's now southern Iraq. You want to go loot Uruk. Well, Uruk has got this honking great wall all around it, so you can't get in. But obviously, if you're getting societies organised enough to build a wall several kilometres long, too high to climb over easily, these same societies are organised enough to be able to besiege a city like that. So we start getting actual sieges happening, attackers coming, camping down outside the city, stopping anybody from getting out. Now, sieges are really scary, really dangerous and uncertain, risky kinds of things. So people are looking for ways to prevent their cities coming under siege. And they come up with the obvious answer. Somebody wants to come and besiege us, so they've got to come with an organised group of people. Well, let's organise ourselves and march out and stop them from besieging us. We will deliberately clash head-on with this group of organised people coming together, something you would never see in the tribal warfare world. And this seems to be, this is the birth of the traditional kind of battle, deliberate clash between bodies of increasingly heavily armed soldiers on a piece of ground seeking to actually destroy one another, break each other as fighting forces, something through tens of thousands of years you just hadn't seen that. And so you've got these more complex societies trying to figure out, well, how do we manage and organise this? How do you do this kind of thing well? Because you're lining up, tossing stones and yelling abuse at each other. This really isn't going to cut it anymore. They start organising themselves, start training themselves. They basically, about 5,000 years ago, they invent discipline, something which really hasn't been there in fighting before. You want a new kind of human being, basically, to fight these battles. Now, fortunately, the societies, and this is kind of, I think, the underlying theme in the story, that the military and the rest of society always move together, always tightly tied together. These new societies, hierarchical societies, they are giving you just the kind of human you need, who's one who will follow orders. And you, as the rulers in the society, you've got the power to force people to follow your orders. You can use discipline on them if they don't follow your orders, in a way you kind of can't do in these tiny hunter-gatherer bands. And ancient armies, I'm sure many of you will know, ancient armies, famously ferocious discipline that they applied to their soldiers. So you discipline these men, you train them to stand their ground, even when you're now moving into a world 5,000 years ago where you've got metal weapons and armour beginning to develop. You've now got guys coming right up to you with a 3-metre long piece of wood with a big old bronze spike on the end of it, planning to drive it into your bowels. And that is, I've never had this happen to me, luckily, but I've got a pretty strong feeling that is terrifying. You're training people to stand their ground against that kind of thing and not run away. And this is an entirely new thing in the history of the world. And we got quite a lot of documentation about it, partly from artistic representations. The first picture we've got that looks like serried ranks of infantry advancing on each other dates back to about 2450 BC from Iraq. And we can tell also from the excavations, from digging up from people's graves, the weapons. You go from like these throwing spears, these javelins and the bows and arrows. You go toward heavy thrusting spears. You can disembowel people with one thrust. And we start to get metal armour, like shields, helmets, bronze breastplates and so on, which again, you don't need this sort of stuff in tribal warfare. Now you really need it because people are trying to dig your guts out with a pointed stick. So we see lots of evidence for this. And we see huge variety around the world in the way that they do this, but the same basic stuff going on pretty much everywhere where agriculture gets started. And by the first millennium BC, by the time of the Roman Republic and the Han Dynasty in China, you're getting armies, sometimes hundreds of thousands of men strong, disciplined to work together. And everywhere does it a little bit differently. Like, so say if you're in India, they have war elephants, which you don't have anywhere else. Some other places they have chariots, and everywhere's a little bit different. But all of the different places share two big trends that are kind of going on together. One is the rise of command and control as a central thing in the battle. Again, totally absent back in the Stone Age societies. You don't need any of that. Now, though, you've got tens of thousands of men on a battlefield. And victory on this battlefield depends largely on your ability to maneuver these troops, make weaknesses in the enemy position, and exploit them. Command and control, this has never been an issue before. Now you've got to have top-down organizations that can move the troops around the battlefield and get the guys to stand where they are, even when it gets really nasty. And from the accounts we get among the ancient historians, it looks like they all actually, probably this is a function of human psychology more than anything, they all get rather similar sort of results in their battles. Their armies will stand and fight until casualties come to about 1/3 of the total number of men there. At that point, it seems regardless of culture or anything, that's when people break and run. Like 10% of you have been killed, 20% of you have been wounded. At that point, very few armies will stand and fight. Well, there are exceptions here. The 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, they really did stand to the last man and be slaughtered on the spot they were defending. And if you walk over that battlefield, even now today, you can still find bronze and iron arrowheads around the battlefield. So there were exceptions, but this sort of 1/3 rule becomes the norm. Armies will stand to that point. And the second big thing, shared pretty much everywhere, is that you want armies that are disciplined to stand and fight, inflict that 1/3 level on the other side before they inflict it on you. So the other side loses their nerve, they turn and run. And then the second big thing we see everywhere goes along with this kind of battle is pursuit. And this is what makes the difference between a tactical victory and like a strategic victory. And it's something you see all the way from like Alexander the Great at the Battle of Gaugamela through to Napoleon at Austerlitz. You break the enemy, you break their morale, they turn and run, and you have cavalry which will ride them down. Fast-moving troops, prevent them from ever reforming, destroy that enemy army's ability to function on the battlefield, and now you can do whatever you like. Now you can go and burn down Vienna or whatever it is. So this sort of traditional battle, this is something that dominates the world for several thousand years. And it's only really in the last 100 years that it's begun to be, largely now being replaced by new forms of fighting. And basically it's sort of, the traditional battles kind of put themselves out of business starting about 100 years ago. The armies are getting so big that commanders are again beginning to lose any ability to have command and control over what goes on in the battlefield. By 1914, on the Western Front, you've got millions of men in each of these armies. Battle of the Marne, it's 10 to 30, 40 kilometers wide, minimal kind of radio or anything like that. They can't control what's going on. This is the point at which these old top-down, very, very hierarchical ways of doing things, it starts to break down and not work very well. I mean, say something like, obviously, Australian troops think about it, like the Battle of Gallipoli, a classic example of this. They land the troops in the Gallipoli Peninsula, and initially when the Allied troops land, there's actually very few Turkish soldiers there protecting the area. They could have marched in and taken charge of all kinds of things, but they don't have any maps. In fact, nobody has any maps of the Gallipoli Peninsula. They don't know where anything is. And they quickly run into the problem that has become the big problem on the Western Front in World War I, which is not so much what we popularly think, the poison gas, the interlocking cones of machine gun fire, making it impossible for humans to advance. Although obviously these are all very real things. But the big problem is, how do you exploit your breakthroughs? Because the breakthroughs do happen. They do overrun the front lines of the enemy trenches. But the generals have no idea where they've broken through or how much they've broken through. They don't know where to commit the reserves. They don't know what's going on. And so they just kind of bludgeon run away at the enemy lines. And quickly both sides learn to defend in depth. You don't have very many guys in the front rank of trenches, which is getting pounded by artillery. They're all held in reserve. And so you advance, you overrun the enemy trenches, then nobody's giving orders, everybody's confused. Your enemy commits their reserves, they drive you back to where you started. Both sides lose huge numbers, nothing actually changes. So the generals, I mean, in spite of the image we have of all the sort of lions led by donkeys thing in World War I, the generals actually see what's going on right away. But the problem is, what do we do about it? And the Germans turn out to be the one. The Germans actually have all the good ideas in 20th century warfare. They're really, really good at this stuff. They figure out what needs to be done. They call it Auftragstaktik. And we actually often use the German words. It just sounds so much more intellectual if you say it in German. Auftragstaktik, which means kind of mission tactics, a kind of bottom-up way of fighting your battles. For thousands of years we fought it from the top down, from Alexander the Great issuing his orders, and they get passed down the line, and you do as you're told. Now the German officers start saying, we're not going to do that anymore. And the guys at the top formulate a general plan, and they say, we need to take that ridge over there. Now you guys actually doing the fighting, figure it out. Decide how you're going to do that, because we don't know what's going on in the battlefield. Only you know that. So we need it to be driven from the bottom up. We need to dissolve the great battles of the Marne or whatever, dissolve them into countless tiny actions between little groups of men, where the soldiers, all the way down to private soldiers, they are the ones figuring out what needs to be done. We want you to go forward, not bludgeon your way through the enemy lines, but find out where the strong points are, and infiltrate around them, go miles back behind the front lines, attack, find the command posts, attack and destroy them, sow chaos in the enemy position. So that often the first thing the enemy knows that a battle is going on, they hear shooting coming from behind them. They're not getting orders anymore. Nobody's telling them what's going on because nobody knows anymore. You've sowed complete chaos in the enemy line. Next thing you know, enemy soldiers are going to start surrendering in huge numbers because they just don't know what's happening anymore. This is the way to break through this trench warfare. But to do this, you need, again, a new kind of soldier, somebody different from the traditional soldiers fighting the traditional battles. You need soldiers who are not doing what you want because you are driving them with whips from the back, ordering them. There's a strict discipline. They must do what they're told. You want people who want to fight this battle, people who have a sense of patriotism, people who are intelligent and educated enough to figure it out for themselves, committed enough to their country to be willing to risk their lives in order to fight these battles. This is the new sort of soldier you want. And luckily, this is the sort of person that modern industrialized societies are producing. You've got mass education has come in. People are beginning to be taught to think for themselves a lot more, take their own initiative. And all of the armies pretty quickly discover we can have our soldiers do this. We don't have to try to control every last thing they do. We can leave it up to them to figure out how to win these battles. They will infiltrate their way into the enemy lines. And the Germans start doing this first. And they do it on the Eastern Front. Russian army at Riga collapses in front of them. They do it on the Italian front, and at Caporetto, the Italian army collapses, 250,000 prisoners get taken. The Germans advance 60 miles in a couple of days, unheard of advance for World War I. Then they unleash it on the Western Front in 1918. The British Fifth Army dissolves in the face of this German attack. Eventually the German attack peters out, and as I'm sure many of you will know, Australian troops had a very distinguished part in kind of grinding that attack to a halt. But by 1918 it's become clear this is how you fight a modern battle. A modern battle is all about infiltration, initiative from the bottom up, letting the troops loose to figure out the best way to achieve a general plan. And of course, this is the basic idea of German blitzkrieg in the Second World War. They take this to a whole new level, combined armed infantry, armour, air, all working together, striking, making holes in the enemy line, striking way back behind with these armoured thrusts, disrupting the supply lines, blowing up the command centres. You sow chaos, you turn war into utter chaos. And your thinking is, we will win the chaos because our guys are better trained, better organised, better motivated than the enemy. Because if you're wrong about that, you lose. But this is the thinking behind it. And basically, this has dominated the major set-piece wars right up to our own time. And in its essentials, the 2003 invasion of Iraq is not that different from the sort of thing that the German army is doing in World War II. So, okay, to wrap up, just a few words here at the end about, well, what next? What happens next? And of course, I don't know any better than the rest of you, in fact, probably less well than the rest of you, what is likely to happen next. But thinking about this long-term trajectory, I mean, I see sort of two main possibilities of the broad directions things might go. And one is that modern battle just becomes more modern. We get increasingly educated soldiers, more and more able to operate on their own, doing the same sort of things we've seen in the 20th century, just more of it. Second possibility, I think, is that battle basically ceases to have the functions that it's been having in war. That we're perhaps beginning to move into a world where these set-piece battles are not going to be the important thing in war anymore, just like they weren't back in the age of the Stone Age hunters and gatherers. And that the war's going to be fought primarily for us by the machinery that we've created. But of course, who knows where things are actually going to go? I think the one thing we'd be absolutely certain of, though, that the 21st century is going to see more change in how battles have been fought than any other century in history. So thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. So, one of the things, I'll start off, if I may, with one of the first questions. So, war is often described, and battle is described as a contest of wills. Mm-hmm. How have you seen that change over history from being very much an individual thing to the will of an organised group? Mm-hmm. And where do you see that going in the future?
Yeah. I mean, this is the line called Clausewitz made this really famous. This idea that he had this great line. He said, in war, everything is very simple. But the simplest thing is very difficult. And it's just difficult to get anything done. He talked about friction. You're trying to do something really simple. You move your army from point A to point B. But there's 20,000 guys out there, all doing slightly different things, all with slightly different agendas. And pretty soon it just dissolves into nothing is getting done. And so he said, the thing that keeps stuff happening in an army is the will of the commander to drive it forward. And so war becomes, as you say, this contest of wills. And I guess I would say in certain ways that maybe is a constant that really hasn't changed all that much. What has changed dramatically is the form that the contest takes. But the contest of wills, I mean, even in the hunter-gatherer sort of primitive battle kind of thing, it's a contest of wills. And you're trying to make the other side run away, and then you can come home and say, look how brave I was today. Aren't I a great big man? So that is very different from the Battle of Stalingrad, say, but it's the same underlying thing, the conflict of wills.
Okay. We have a question from Captain Rich Thornton. We had discrete local issue battles, and then we had big top-down driven battles, and now big commander intent-driven bottom-up planned battles with mission command, so the modern version of Auftragtaktik. Where do you think it's going to go next? And I suppose I would add to his question, we have a lot of technological advances coming up, some of which we don't even really comprehend. Yeah. How is the passage of information and intent going to change the modern battle? Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of theorising about this, of course, as I'm sure you're all aware, and a lot of different ideas about what the impact of technology, in particular, is going to be in shaping the larger struggle, the conflict of wills, and so on. And my understanding of it is there's sort of two main schools of thought about the way the technology is going to impact future battles. One is to say that it's going to turn into basically a struggle of technologies. And future battles, well, this guy, George Friedman, who founded the organisation Stratfor, and writes a lot about warfare. And I should say, I actually work for Stratfor on the side, so I should say that. And he has this vision of what future battles are going to be like. He likes to say that the great wars of the future are going to be global wars, but not total wars. And by that, what he meant is that they'll draw in the whole world, but they're not going to be like the wars of the 20th century, with millions of people called up and wartime economies put into place and all this kind of thing. That it'll be a relatively quick struggle. And he sees it as something going on, there'll be kind of this cyber storm going on as each side tries to disable the other side's entire
technological backbone of what they're doing. Major fighting in space to try to disable other people's communication satellite systems. And increasingly, the battlefield will be taken over by robotic devices. It just works so fast that any involvement of humans in the loop on these sort of what they're doing, it's just going to be a disadvantage for the armies. And his vision of this is there'll be like this sort of technological, I don't know, like battle of the robots kind of deal going on. And at the end of it, you'll realize, oops, my robots aren't as good as your robots. My robots are losing. Okay, uncle, we give up. And the casualties will be very small, and war will become this sort of ultra-professionalised thing between the machinery, different systems of machinery. I got to say, I tend to think that is a little bit optimistic. That when you look back over history at what's happened when radically new forms of fighting come in, the idea is often that they transcend everything that's gone before. So like, say, when cavalry come onto the battlefield or chariotry come onto the battlefield, you get these phases where the battle will actually be decided by a clash just between the chariot forces, say in the Middle East 3,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago, and the infantry basically kind of stand there watching this go on. But it doesn't then turn out the way George Friedman predicts in the future, where the infantry then say, oh, okay, we lost, we'll go home now. Instead, the winning chariot force slaughters the infantry on the losing side. And my suspicion is that what we are going to get, if there's ever, God forbid, if there's ever another all-out great power war, is there will be this kind of cyber storm, space war, combined with all-out nuclear assaults, armoured attacks. Everything will be going on at once, and there'll be a sort of battering away at each other in this form. And then when the electronic armoured shell over one side cracks and breaks, everything comes crashing through it, and we see hundreds of millions of casualties, which is a very bleak vision of it. And maybe it's totally wrong. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Yeah. This is just my projection forward from what I see happening in the past. Yeah. But one of the things looking at the past tells you is that often the past is not a very good guide. So let's hope it's not.
Okay. We have a question in the audience here.
Yeah, g'day, sir. Warren Brent Dorr from Headquarters Forces Command. Firstly, thanks very much for a great presentation.
Thank you.
The transition between the tribal warfare and the traditional, and then from the traditional to the modern, was there any common aspects between those transition points that potentially we can predict coming forward about where the next transition might go?
Yeah, I think we don't know very much about the transition from the tribal world to the traditional world, because it's pretty much always it goes on before writing has been invented. So we're guessing at this stuff from looking at the archaeological evidence, trying to figure out what might lie behind what was going on. We know a lot more about the transition from these traditional top-down, highly regimented armies to the much more fluid kind of modern armies. And in that case, what we see is like with the transition to the modern kind of battle fighting, people begin to be aware of what's going on long before they adapt very effectively to it. And also, there are adaptations to the new forms of warfare. Like, say, in the American Civil War, they start off big lines of guys in brightly coloured uniforms charging at each other, but now the other side, they've got rifles instead of muskets, and they just slaughter each other. And pretty quickly people realise, oh my God, this is disaster, we've got to fight our wars a different way. And they start doing this, and they start figuring out new ways to do it in the 1860s. But then these experiments regularly fizzle out, because the people don't build on them. The war ends, and nobody kind of picks it up. And it doesn't transfer, it's not picked up by other countries, other armies very, very easily. Like, say, like the British experience in the Boer War, a little over 100 years ago. Pretty quickly they realise that traditional armies are getting slaughtered on these battlefields by these Boer sharpshooters. They start developing tactics to deal with that. But then, 12 years later, as the First World War breaks out, it's like all that just gets pushed aside. No, we don't have to do that anymore. So I think one of the things we see is, I think, is on one hand how good armies can be on the battlefield at figuring out what they need to do. On the other hand, how bad they can be sometimes at translating that into new kinds of doctrine.
There's a wonderful comment in Field Marshal Slim's book, Unofficial Histories, the chapter written after the First World War says, the British Army, now that the inconvenience of the war was out of the way, was quite happy to get back to soldiering, which I think sums up what you were,
that's really good.
Saying.
I will start stealing that line from you.
Yes, we have another question here from the audience.
Professor Morris, thank you today for your speech.
thanks.
As the resident logistics officer in the command, my brain automatically starts thinking about how the administration and governance and logistics of those different types of warfare changes throughout the year, and I'd be keen to hear any insights you may have on logistics, which is such a complex term that we actually created the term, how we were going to go into the future, or how it's changed over the three different types of warfare.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I could very easily have given this talk as about three different styles of logistics, which I think there are. Each has its own logistical style. With the tribal warfare, I mean, there are no logistics. Like when people go on these raids off to other people's villages, they pack a lunch to go and they take it on, or maybe they'll take a route where they know they'll go past some breadfruit trees or something, and they'll go there. And the raids usually the raid has to succeed the first time, because if it doesn't, they've got no food. They can't stay there for days and days in the woods waiting for an opportunity. So they give up and go home again. So there's almost no logistical support. Because again, who's going to organise it? There isn't anybody to do this. And one of the things that the traditional armies, one of the very first things they start doing, along with the invention of discipline, the creation of new kinds of weapons, is the organisation of logistical trains. And we start hearing a lot about this in the earliest written documents from almost all of the ancient states, about the difficulties of centralising food and how quickly it all goes off and how difficult it is to move it around. And the logistics hugely shape the kind of campaigns you can fight, because it's really difficult to fight very far away from a river, because you put stuff on a boat and move it around reasonably easy, heavy, bulky food stuff. If you put, I forget all the numbers, I'm sure I've got this wrong, but like if you put grain on the back of a donkey and start moving it inland, over the course of a week or so, the donkey is going to eat the entire load of grain it's carrying just to stay alive. You cannot do this kind of thing. And so the Romans are the masters of almost all this stuff in the ancient world. The Romans are the ones who start to develop really sophisticated logistical trains. But again, of course, you see this very much with the modern kinds of battle as well. That when Napoleon, one of the things that made him such a military genius was his ability to make the traditional battles flexible and be really clever about how he did it. And one of the big things he figures out is that old-style armies, 18th century armies, move really slowly because they've got these huge supply chains that back them up. And the slightest little thing can stop the entire campaign. And so he says, can't do that, but I can't feed an army of 100,000 men because they'll eat all the food up and everybody dies. This is bad. So he figures out this idea. You break them down into separate corps, usually 3 corps, each of which can fight a standalone battle, combines infantry, cavalry and artillery, but each of which is small enough that it can feed itself as it advances forward. And you have these 3 or 4 corps advancing along parallel lines within roughly a day's march of each other. And the idea is you're going forward with these separate armies, small enough that you can keep them moving forward. And if they run into a really big enemy army, they will hear the battle taking place. The other corps will hear the battle taking place. An individual corps, it's got combined arms and it can stand and fight for, say, a day against an army 2 or 3 times its size, which gives the other corps time to march toward the sound of the guns and join it. And you can suddenly concentrate this enormous force in one place. The guy was a horrible man, but an absolute military genius. And of course, the more fluid modern kinds of battle, being able to supply like say in the Second World War, being able to supply the panzers that are running so far ahead of the bulk of the army, the German army in the Russian campaign. This became like the big challenge in a lot of ways in 1941, like the thing that kind of derails them, slows them down in front of Moscow. So yeah, you could easily write the parallel story of this in terms of logistics.
Thank you. A lot of those problems exist today, but if I can take one thing away, everyone's going to have a pack of lunch from here on.
If I can pick up on one of the points you made there, quite often 2 armies may actually have very, very similar technologies, but it's the one which can conceptually use it the best or the most innovatively to unhinge the enemy's plan.
Yeah.
And 1940 is probably a great example. The French had as many, if not more, tanks than the Germans, but they used them in 3s rather than massing them for breakthrough. What throughout history have you seen has been the catalyst for being able to conceptualise the use of new technologies? What do we need to be doing now to understand these emerging technologies that come through?
God, that's a really good question. Now, if I had the answer, I would be rich and famous. Wouldn't be sitting here now. But yeah, and historically, one of the things we've seen is increasingly sophisticated, basically staff office work, and people kind of intellectualizing warfare and figuring out exactly the sort of thing you're talking about. How do we slot these new technologies in? What needs to be done? And the most successful armies, in my sense of it, is that the most successful armies have been the ones where there is a lot of feedback between the kind of more academic side of things, the general office, the general officer's staff, and the guys actually on the battlefield. So a lot of armies, especially in the age of traditional warfare, it's so hierarchical, and officers are all drawn from the aristocracy, and the soldiers in the ranks are all, kind of shanghaied and conscripted. Well, not all, but a lot of them are. There's huge social divisions in these armies. It's really difficult to have two-way communication going on. And so, I mean, some of these armies, like Napoleon's army, again, a classic example of this. They had this saying that every French soldier has a field marshal's baton in his backpack. This idea that anybody, and it does actually happen, anybody can move up to the very top levels, and they talk to each other all the time. And so the generals thinking about planning the campaign in 1805 or whatever, they actually know about what's happening with the troops. And that sort of communication, that's difficult to do. I mean, in the US Army, I suspect the same in the Australian Army. There's a lot of emphasis on turning the army into a learning institution. How do we create these educational structures where people are talking to each other and sharing ideas? And again, I obviously don't know so much about the Australian Army, only having been with you guys for a few days now, but I went along with some exercises with the US Army, and I was really impressed by the after-action reviews that they had. And in one case in particular, you've got a room full of guys, mostly private soldiers, but it's all the way up to, there's a 4-star general sitting there in the room. But it was like, and this discussion gets going, it's like nobody has a rank in this room at all. They are being so forthright with each other about what had gone wrong, because this exercise had gone spectacularly wrong. What had gone wrong on this exercise? And it was a kind of, unhierarchical discussion that went way beyond what we have in most university settings. We pride ourselves on being these open intellectual communities in university, but I was just so impressed by what they were doing there. But I mean, clearly though, talking to the people in that room, this is really difficult to do, to get the information moving in both directions, and with the Auftrags tactic kind of thing, to make it that the ordinary soldiers on the battlefield do understand the intent of the officer, why we're doing this, why are we taking this stupid hill, and why are we now abandoning this stupid hill? Because I mean, if you don't know that, then it's hard to imagine anything more disheartening. If you lost a lot of your friends storming this hill, and now some buffoon shows up and says, well, walk away, we don't actually want the hill anymore. So I think that I would say if there's one big thing, that's it. It's learning back and forth kind of communication.
And I've got a question here as well from Captain Douglas at Forces Command. The recent US doctrine, which has gained traction around the world, now says, and the US security strategies now says, we're in a period permanently of competition. And what we're trying to do is stop it becoming conflict. And so it's competition at all levels. Looking back through history and from what you've been talking about today, how do we now identify, with the advent of cyber, EW, computer systems, etc., where that threshold is between competition and conflict?
Yeah.
Is that the next model? Is that the next model modern battle?
Yeah. I think I would say there's sort of two sides to this, and one side is the sort of permanent kind of logic of conflict and strategy that applies regardless of time and place, so the basic underlying logic. And this is the one, Clausewitz again, he's the guy who really, I think, identified, formalized, made explicit what's going on, with this famous line about war being the continuation of politics with other means added, means of killing people, added into it. And his basic thinking was that, war, there's constant competition going on between political organizations, between states, and there's all kinds of different ways you can pursue this competition. And you can pursue it through soft power, of doing stuff like giving foreign aid to islands in the Pacific to make them like Australia. Make them think Australia is a great place. We like Australians. We want to be on their side. We stand for the same things as Australia. And if you can persuade them of that, of course they're less likely to cozy up to people you might not want them to be friends with. Or you can do it, say, through your harder form of struggle, of, say, economic sanctions. You put tariffs on the other side's goods. And the idea, of course, is to hurt the other side by putting tariffs on them, putting sanctions on them, and so that they'll stop acting in ways you don't like in order to stop the pain. And turning to violence and warfare, it's another way of hurting the other side. You say, well, now I'm really going to hurt you, and now I'm going to start killing your people. But this can stop. You've just got to agree to do what I said I want you to do. This can stop. And that kind of logic, I think that never goes away regardless of the technological level. But that's one side of it. The other side of it is that the new things coming in. I mean, I think we've seen this throughout history. When new things come in, it can change the forms the struggle takes so much that everything certainly feels different, even if the logic underneath it is the same. And the stuff that's happening now, I mean, there's never been changes like this really in the whole history of warfare. And I think particularly, the advent of nuclear weapons is this huge threshold. That changes everything. Because now we've got this new kind of war. We've got your war, and then we've got your nuclear war. And your nuclear war, and particularly when you get into the late 50s, and you start having the thermonuclear weapons. We have megatons of destruction rather than kilotons. Now you're talking about killing tens of millions of people now. And so there's this level of war out there now that pretty much everybody realizes right from the beginning, we cannot go there. If we allow our conflicts to go there, that's the end of everything. But now we've got all this other stuff, and we don't know what's going to happen if somebody goes kind of all out cyber on somebody else. There's been all this cyber skirmishing going on. We don't know what it's possible to do with this. All the indications are at the moment that there's really no practical defense against major cyber attacks. All you can hope to do is deter them by having your own cyber to strike back. But as everybody knows, it's really hard to tell where these cyber attacks are coming from. It's like the deterrence that did work in the Cold War with nuclear weapons, it's not obvious that that's going to work with cyber. And the cyber, I mean, obviously you're not directly killing people violently with cyber, but you can do stuff that leads to countless deaths. So it is an act of violence. But what do we do about it? What is an appropriate response to a cyber attack? And what different kinds of cyber attacks? And this, I think, is where traditionally, historically, where the logic of the conflict can get obscured and break down. And people start doing wild and crazy stuff because we don't know what's going to happen with new forms of warfare. So this is just really, really scary.
I suppose to take that one step further, if I may, we've gone from 50 years ago, thermonuclear war, end of the world as we know it, and a nuclear winter. And sometimes when we're talking about cyber, we talk about the ability for us to create lethal effects through opening dams and sluices, etc. But there's also the ability to completely cripple a country without harming a single person physically. Is that war?
Yeah, I would certainly say so. Yeah, I mean, but it certainly becomes very grey and messy. I mean, I know there are units in the US that have been working on the ability to paralyze enemy weapon systems without actually shooting anybody or anything, but kind of shut down their missile defense systems, shut down, and so particularly in the Air Force, I mean, so much of what goes on is now computerized. Just shut it down, and the aircraft can't function anymore. And I mean, I would say that's a little bit like if you could abruptly suppress, say in the Second World War, if you'd had some magic button that could have abruptly suppressed all anti-aircraft guns in the United Kingdom. Not an act of war in itself, but the point of doing that, of course, is now you can say you are now naked before us, exposed completely to our destructive violence. We just shut down the whole US anti-ballistic missile system, so now we can kill you if we want to. And that's an act of war. That's a threat of absolute destruction. So, but yeah, again, what are the responses? What is appropriate? How do you deal with these situations? Nobody's had to do it yet.
I suppose that leads on to a question that's come in. Can we get? Do you think we've had mutually assured destruction as a strategy, almost to stop war? You know, the argument against thermonuclear war is nobody wins.
Yeah.
Do you think with things such as cyber that we will get to the same stage of mutually assured total destruction of the way societies can function, and therefore we get to the point where a first strike becomes less and less likely because the cyber consequences will be so severe.
Yeah, I mean, of course, that would be one way to handle the cyber war, if you could have deterrence of the Cold War type. The problem I think a lot of people foresee with that is this whole thing about the difficulty of attributing where the attack came from. Was it China? Was it Russian hackers who may be independent of the government, but they are kind of working for the government? Was it some pimply teenager in a basement in Des Moines, Iowa? You don't know. And it can, I mean, people talk about it, maybe it might take you weeks or even months to work out what happened. And politically, is that possible? If there's a cyber attack on your country, a devastating one that causes large numbers of deaths, paralyzes the country, and the president, prime minister has to come on TV and say, well, we don't know who did this. And it may be 6 months before we know, I'll get back to you. It's very hard to see how governments are going to survive under these sorts of conditions.
So that will place a real pressure on the functioning of the state.
Yeah, yeah.
I suppose, and this question comes in from Corporal Gardner at the Combined Arms Training Centre, does things such as mutually assured destruction or mutually assured state dysfunction through things such as cyber mean that actually we will go back to a more traditional mode of conflict and battle because we don't want to push it above that threshold? In the same way that nuclear warfare did. We've had plenty of conflicts without, since the thermonuclear weapons were available, without having ever escalated to that. Do you think the same thing might happen with cyber?
Yeah, I mean, that would be great if that were to happen. And I think, again, going back to Clausewitz again, I mean, one of the things Clausewitz said is that war always moves toward the extreme. This is something that you unleash something primal, destructive violence in people. It's always going to escalate and go toward the extreme. And yet, in the Cold War, I mean, this truly remarkable thing happened that for 70-odd years, no, that's not, 50-odd years. You've got these nuclear-armed superpowers that managed to... They carry on having competition and conflict, but they manage to do it in ways that don't escalate to the threshold of nuclear war. And not that made what they did very nice. I mean, they fight these proxy wars. 2-3 million die in Vietnam. 1 million plus die in the Korean War. All these terrible things are going on, but it could be much worse. And they manage to learn to manage their conflicts in ways that don't go up to that level. And potentially, maybe that's possible in the cyber world too. I mean, again, this is something nobody really knows. I mean, there's some of the more hawkish elements in the US say that, well, the thing you do, if you make it known that if your country suffers a severe cyber attack from anybody, we cyber everybody. And that way, we don't know who did it, but we're going to get you. We're going to get a lot of other people too, but we're going to get you. Because that strikes me as a slightly silly doctrine, because it just opens it so much to groups who want to see massive destabilization.
Chaos.
Yeah, you can get that now. They get the US to do it for you.
And that's where your spotty kid in a basement in Iowa
It's
really
scary.
It does get very scary.
Yes.
Professor Morris, we've sadly run out of time. But thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating Keogh Chair presentation, not only to the audience here in Victoria Barracks, Sydney, but across Australia live from here. So I'd like to thank everyone here to thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us here at the Cove. We've got a pretty packed programme coming up through to the end of the year, which we'll announce online shortly. I also encourage those units or those personnel who deployed on exercise Talisman Sabre 19. Our writing competition is still open. Please, we've already got submissions rolling in. Your thoughts matter. Your views can help shape us to be a more professional army as we move into the future. So please do get those submissions coming in. From the team here at the Cove, in coordination with the Australian Army Research Centre, thank you for joining us.